Well, we had Jacob running away from Esau, and he's going to relatives up by Haran, to where Laban is living, his mother's brother. And so he gets there, and then he pushes the big stone off of the well so he can water Rachel's and Laban's sheep. And then he's so excited that he kisses her and tells her that he's a cousin, and then pretty quickly she runs home and tells her dad what's going on. Then he comes and then invites Jacob to come stay with them for a while. Von Rod interprets Rachel's running off as she became agitated, as though she's disturbed by all of this attention from this stranger, but he doesn't really explain it, and he doesn't give any explanation of the Hebrew words that are used in the text to come to that conclusion. But he's the only one that says she was agitated of the scholars I studied. But then when Laban goes and greets Jacob and then invites him back to home, it says that Jacob recounts all that he did and all that had happened. Now, we're not sure what all that might have been and what it meant, and so it raises some questions. When he recounted all that had happened, was Jacob confessing and coming clean about all of the deception and the betrayal and the dishonesty? Or was he only telling the details of the trip that we didn't get? That he just shows up. All of a sudden he's there. One sentence he's running away, and the next sentence he arrives. But if he confesses it all, then when Laban responds, "You are indeed my flesh and blood," or my kinfolk, is he saying, well, you're just like me. You are a trickster and a deceiver and a swindler, just like me. And knowing what's coming next, if we've heard the story over and over and again, we might suspect, well, that's what he means. But we're not for sure. However, Jacob's recounting to Laban all that had happened might have been told in such a way that Jacob dodged real confession, but blamed his mother and the circumstances that were not under his control for all the turn of events. So if Laban could have heard how manipulative his sister Rebekah had been by Jacob's blaming it on her, and thought, yes, indeed, her son is my kin, and I too can manipulate him to do my bidding. If he's so easily manipulated, then, oh boy, here I've got another victim that I can manipulate. So I'll embrace him as family and get him to work for me, become my servant. And I can manipulate him in other ways as well as the story evolves. Anyway, and then again, another way of looking at it, Jacob could have just skimmed over the family drama and told Laban all about his encounter with God and God's promise. Maybe that's what is in all that happened. And then Laban could have said, oh yes, you are family, and maybe I can get in on all this blessing and prosperity that the Lord has promised you. Well, I'll become your father-in-law, and my daughters will be rich and famous as well. Maybe that's what makes him so readily willing to embrace this Jacob as family. You are indeed my flesh and blood. Well, these are loaded words, and they are a claim of some kind of special bond and relationship. We're not sure what that will be, but the reader and the listener to the story is supposed to understand that there is a lot of baggage that's going to come with that statement. dates duties and obligations of kinship, rights and privileges of kinship, the customs and traditions that come with kinship are all loaded in that, as well as traits and characteristics that may seem to be in your genes that are a part of this kinship. Well, when we get through that, then we need to move on to get to the point of when anyway, Rebekah had run and told her father, and when Laban heard the news about his sister's son Jacob, he ran to meet him, and he embraced him and kissed him and brought him to his house or to his tents. We're not sure. It doesn't explain whether it's houses or tents or what the setup is. Jacob told Laban all these things, and Laban said to him, "Surely you are my bone and my flesh," in this translation. And he stayed with him a month. Now that month indicates that this may be one tradition that's separate from staying with him for all the years that are about to come. But anyway, it could just be a transition time. He's been a guest for a month. And then Laban said to Jacob, "Because you are my kinsman, should you therefore serve me for nothing? Tell me, what shall your wages be?" Now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the elder was Leah, and the name of the younger Rachel. Leah's eyes were lovely in this translation. Some translations say tender, some say weak. Anyway, but she had special eyes that called attention. But Rachel was graceful and beautiful. Now some translations say formally, meaning well formed, and beautiful, which means she's not only got a pretty face, but she's got a pretty body, and she's just really well put together is the image here. And Jacob loved Rachel. So he said, and so we guess it's love at first sight. He said, because he fell in love with her at the well. Anyway, "I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter Rachel." And Laban said, "It is better that I give her to you than that I should give her to any other man. Stay with me." Now, if we'll notice, he doesn't say, "Okay, it's a deal." This is kind of vague and ambiguous response. And the "stay with me" isn't stay as a guest, but the expression really means you will now be my indentured servant. So anyway, Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed to him but a few days because of the love he had for her. Then Jacob said to Laban, now we've got 7 years, goes right by very quick, "Give me my wife that I may go into her, for my time is completed." So Laban didn't protest. He gathered together all the people of the place and made a feast. But in the evening he took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob, and he went into her. And Laban gave his maid Zilpah to his daughter Leah to be her maid. Now when morning came, it was Leah. And Jacob said to Laban, "What is this you have done to me? Did I not serve with you for Rachel? Why then have you deceived me?" And Laban said, "This is not done in our country, giving the younger before the firstborn. Complete the week of this one, and we will give you the other also, in return for serving me yet another 7 years. And Jacob did so, and he completed her week. And then Laban gave him his daughter Rachel for wife. And Laban gave his maid Bilhah to his daughter Rachel to be her maid. So Jacob went in to Rachel also, and he loved Rachel more than Leah. He served Laban for another 7 years. Well, we'll stop there for now. Now, the questions of these wages and pay emerges, and the commentators tell us that people who work for other folks in those times had different categories. There were some who were slaves, and usually they were foreigners. They weren't of the same bloodline or traditions and so forth. Different ways they became slaves that they didn't go into. But anyway, slavery was a common practice. But what they did enjoy was maintenance and care and protection, because they were a valuable resource to the slave owner in order to do various kinds of labor and work. But there was no pay, and there was no freedom to leave. And then there were some paid workers, like shepherds. We've learned other places that shepherds were kind of the lowliest caste. Shepherding work wasn't easy work, and it wasn't glamorous work, and it was dangerous work, hazardous work, but they were paid something. And then there were another category, domestic servants, people who worked in the house. And if they weren't slave girls, they would do other domestic work and would be paid. But Jacob was none of these. He was a relative, but he was doing lots of work, serving his future father-in-law in order to win a wife. So if he is to work for Laban, it pointed out Laban's sense of honor and reputation in the community as a fair, decent man required, even if he didn't want to, that he be required to have some agreement, some understanding that he was treating this person fairly who was doing all this work for him. So they needed to negotiate some payment, some contract for the service. Now, since daughters were considered property of the father and transferred from one owner to another at the wedding time, and when we do weddings here, we change the traditional who gives this woman to be married to this man, because a lot of young women, particularly after they're educated and through college and started their own career, they're not a young girl who needs support, who's given away from the kind of possession and control of a father to the possession and control of a husband, or come together as equal, although that kind of tradition of father walking the bride down the aisle, what are you going to ask him? Well, we say, who presents this woman to be married to this man, instead of who gives. A lot of females have brought that up and didn't like the giving part because of the historic meaning of that idea. But anyway, just in case you didn't know, you got any plans? That's the way we do things. Anyway, and actually our revised wedding liturgy, if you want to look it up in the back of the hymnal, doesn't even have that. It's dropped that out, but since a lot of young people like that tradition, then we put it back in, but not as who gives, but who presents. Anyway, well, this is what is going on here. Since daughters are property, and since Jacob showed up all worn and bedraggled, fleeing from his homeland, he didn't have anything to offer. If we remember Abraham's servant coming with camels and with jewelry and gifts, Jacob shows up with nothing. The only thing he has to offer is his labor. And so they make this contract for kind of the dowry or the bride price in these primitive customs in the olden days. But in the words of Laban, in response to Jacob's offer to work for 7 years for Rachel's hand, it is ambiguous, and he really doesn't promise anything. His words are kind of thinking out loud. Now you're offering me 7 years of labor. I guess it'd probably better to accept your labor than to give her to somebody else, and then I won't get that labor out of you because you'll be mad and you'll go away. So kind of gives us feeling of thinking out loud in that first part, but then he says, stay with me, which seems to more or less confirm the acceptance of the agreement. But anyway, the prospects for a better offer were probably slim, since 7 years servanthood was indeed a very high value and a high price, and Laban could hardly refuse. And Jacob probably knew it by making such a generous offer. Well, he loved Rachel so much that he did bid very high for her hand. But according to the custom, Rachel would remain in Laban's household even after the marriage. And it was not expected that, I'll work for you 7 years, I'd get Rachel for my wife, and then together we'll go back home. I mean, he wasn't expecting to go back home. He was still pretty afraid of what would happen if he went back. So he's pretty much planning to stay there as well. But in spite of God's promise to him, Jacob may have believed that he himself would live out his life in exile, or maybe make his pilgrimage back home in his old age, but not to hurry and go back soon. Was not his intent at all. Anyway, this agreement seems to be struck, and the time passes quickly because Jacob is in so much in love. That sounds a little hard to believe. If she is so beautiful and he loves her so much and he's close to her, he's going to twiddle his thumbs for 7 years? Now, I may have been all warped by our instant everything nowadays with the fast food and all, to think that someone would wait 7 years. My goodness. But also, you could be thinking, well, back in the olden times, like, Genesis, we just turn back a few chapters and we read about people living 600, 700, 900 years. Well, what is 7 years in comparison with 800? So it's just a short wait. But actually, by the time we get to these characters, they're living normal life length, and so 7 years is a big amount of time. But anyway, but I think it's has something to do with just the legendary quality of the patriarch stories at this time, and they didn't go into any symbolism of the years of 7. It's numbers have big symbols, but at this point, none of the commentators made anything of the number 7 for this. Well, anyway, for the reader and the listener, for us, 7 years passes very quickly. They make the deal, and the next thing we know, 7 years has passed. And he's coming and say, well, I've served my time. And you might notice also it's Jacob who brings the issue up. Laban doesn't go to Jacob and say, well, I've been looking at my calendar here, and I just saw that, you've completed your 7 years. No, it's Jacob who's paying attention to the time. So Laban agrees, and then he makes preparation for this great wedding feast. And we're given the indication that the feasting and the celebration normally lasts a week, but it was indeed a big deal. All the neighbors and friends are gathered together, and they start this feast sometime in the afternoon, we guess, and it goes into the evening. And so The bride, who was most likely veiled, is brought into the wedding chamber late in the evening after there's been much eating and drinking, and it's very light. There aren't electric lights there. And since it's dark and she's veiled, and possibly the groom is somewhat inebriated, the bait and switch is performed and is successful, because in spending the night with her, it's presumed that the marriage was consummated. Now, the commentators say the ceremony itself is just presenting the bride to the groom, dropping her off at the wedding chamber. That's all there is to the ceremony. But the cultural part with all the feasting and so forth, it's a little bit like a lot of weddings nowadays. The ceremony, the vows, are about 7 minutes. But then with big weddings, you've got all kinds of parties and whatnot that goes on before, and we don't have so many weddings here anymore because all the reception and dinner and the dance and all that kind of stuff take place somewhere else. And so, we don't want to mess with transferring the people to the church and then to the reception and the party. Let's just do it all at where we're going to do the party. So, anyway, all the partying is a big deal, and it goes on for a week. Now, we were introduced to the two sisters shortly before this story, and there's just a few verses in this description that Rachel is indeed very beautiful, but Leah is only attribute that's mentioned are her eyes. Now, it doesn't say there's anything wrong with the rest of her, but she's not as striking as Rachel, but the eyes are the only thing that are mentioned. And as I said, there's various words that are chosen to interpret the quality of the eyes. One word was tender, which could mean compassionate. It could mean feeling. There's feeling expressed in the eyes. Lovely. Another couple of words were limpid and melting. But one commentator remarks that in ancient times, the eyes of a woman were quite important, and it was in these ancient times that women began to use makeup on their eyes because the look of the eyes was so very important. And so also, if you realize that very often the women were completely covered. They didn't wear skimpy clothing, didn't wear bikinis down to the well when they were watering the sheep, and often had a veil so that, the eyes were really all that you could actually see directly. And so making up those eyes to be very bright and captivating would be important. And way back in ancient times, women started doing that. So it seems that rather interpreting her as having weak eyes, and this was some pejorative comment, it may have really meant something positive, the lovely eyes or very tender eyes. Dana Fuel makes the comment that one of the differences between the two girls was about eyes. Rachel was to be looked at. Leah had eyes that could take in and understand and be compassionate and caring. Anyway, interesting commentary. And I've got a whole bunch of things that she noticed and wants to share with us about that. But anyway, when Jacob awakens in the morning, he's sober and he has more light, and he discovers the switch. And he's very upset when he confronts Laban. "What have you done to me?" But Laban shows no remorse. And just kind of matter of fact, he states the custom. He's bound by the custom. And if you stop and think about it, all this 7 years he's been waiting for this marriage, and Jacob doesn't know the custom. Why is he surprised? I don't know. They don't say. Nobody brings that up. But anyway, evidently he's so in love that he ignored it. And the problem is, this feast and the gathering, there were lots of witnesses in the community that indeed would have seen the woman taken to the marriage chamber and deposited there, so that whoever that woman was, that was the wife, and there's no getting out of it. He's consummated that marriage, that bond, and he can't undo it. So he's stuck, as it were. Now, Laban's solution to Jacob's upset is simply, "Well, I have to marry the older one off first. By the way, you're getting 2 for 1. Why are you so upset? What's your beef? Finish the week of celebration with this one, with Leah, and then I'll give you Rachel in 6 days. But you'll have to work another 7 years for me." So not only does, we want to be kind of crass about it, does Jacob get 2 for 1, but Laban does too. He only has to do one big wedding expense and feast for the community. So he's quite the shrewd character. Now, Laban assigns a slave girl, Zilpah, to be given to Leah as her maidservant, kind of a wedding gift of sorts. And then when he gives Rachel away, he assigns another slave girl to her, Bilhah, as her maidservant. Now, we're reminded that such a marriage of 2 sisters is later prohibited by law in Leviticus, and a part of it, as long as the one is still living, it's forbidden to marry a sister. If she dies, then it's okay to marry a sister. Now, Bruce Vaughter, in his commentary, spends a lot of ink discussing a discovery of the ancient Nuzi culture and material, and they go back to contemporary times with them, with the ancient patriarchs, and they're in that same general region. And so there is some reason to understand and believe that some of the customs that were practiced that seem a little strange to us and were probably quite anachronistic to the time of the writing of Genesis, but still in the patriarch times, the parts of the story which had some basis in fact, they can find some legal documents that they uncovered of the Nuzi culture that deals with some of the things going on here. And anyway, we discussed it before with Sarah offering Hagar, her slave girl, to Abraham in order to father a child, which he does and produces Ishmael by Hagar. But in the Nuzi law, it was not only a right, but almost an obligation for a barren wife to offer a servant girl to become a surrogate to produce offspring so that there would be an heir. It was so important that there be an heir that if the wife was barren, then a slave girl could produce a child. And because the wife owned the slave girl, then the wife owned the child produced and could kind of adopt that child or claim that child as her own child and try to raise that child with that understanding and just kind of discard the biological mother. But she probably, as sometimes happens with people of privilege. The biological mother could be the nanny that changed the dirty diapers, but we'd dress the kid up and I'd take it to the parties, which creates conflicts, and it's not a very workable solution in real life, but on paper it kind of makes sense. Anyway, nevertheless, Vaughter suggests that Laban giving each daughter a servant girl, a handmaid, is preparation for the possible infertility of one of the girls, or even both. It's kind of an insurance policy. Now, since the expectation was that Jacob and both girls' wives would stay under Laban's rule, under his tent or in his house, he's hoping for grandsons to increase his labor force. A very intriguing possibility of this newsy connection was that this process of giving the maidservants was a wedding gift, as a wedding gift, was also seems to constitute an adoption of the son-in-law as son to secure the inheritance, that then the son, because everything has to be passed through the male, the son-in-law becomes the adopted son and heir of Laban upon his death. But not only would he receive the wealth of the flocks and the servants, but there's also a point about household gods are given to the one who inherits, goes to the heir. Now, the household gods become important later in the narrative. We'll deal with it later. But Laban has only 2 daughters at this time, and in the Newsy Law Code, any sons not yet born but might later be born that come after this adoption, then the inheritance then would be split equally. The adopted son doesn't get unadopted and forgotten. He stays in place, but then the inheritance then is divided among the adopted son and the biological sons. The primogeniture rule doesn't seem to follow in that case. But this goes back to the statement, "You are indeed my flesh and blood, stay with me." And in this sense, it was loaded with this forecast of what was to come. Now, it's interesting, Vaughter found that text, and he edited it, the ancient text that they found of one of these contracts of wedding and adoption, and he just changed the names to put our biblical characters in here to see how it really made sense. He says, tablet of adoption, whereby Laban, the son of Bethuel, has adopted Jacob, the son of Isaac. As long as Laban lives, Jacob will assure him food and clothing. So in adoption, not only you become the heir, but then you have the responsibility of caring for the senior adult there, the senior male. When Laban dies, Jacob will be his heir. If Laban has a son of his own, he will divide the inheritance equally with Jacob. But it is the son of Laban who will take Laban's gods, the household gods. If Laban has no son of his own, then Jacob shall take Laban's gods. Further, Laban has given his daughters Leah and Rachel to be the wives of Jacob. If Jacob takes another wife, he loses all rights to Laban's goods, lands, and buildings and gods. Now, that last line seems to be, it's down here later in the, there's one more paragraph that explains this. It says, the suggestion is that the contract thus adapted to the biblical situation both suits it admirably well and explains some of the ensuing developments these considerations being given full credit. Now remember, Rachel, when Jacob wants to run away and has to escape, it's out from under this contract because Laban is still alive, and Rachel steals the household gods. And so the household gods become a big issue, later in the story. But anyway, number one, Laban's sons, who appear only in chapter 30, verse 35 and 31:1, did not exist at the time of Jacob's marriage and adoption. 2, after these sons had been born, Laban's household gods belonged to them. Hence, Laban's concern over them and the wrongfulness of Rachel's stealing them or appropriating them, according to the story later. Jacob's secret flight from Laban was necessitated by his still being legally bound to him during Laban's lifetime because of this legal act of the adoption, which seems to have taken place, although it's not fully explained in the Genesis text. But if they're writing about times hundreds of years earlier where some of the details are lost, then that may have been going on. Jacob and his wives and all that he had taken with him were still Laban's legitimate possessions, even as he claims in 31:43. And then fourth, in 31:50, Jacob is reminded of his oath not to marry other wives outside the family, which is in accord with this final clause in the Newsy contract. This clause would not have been broken by his union with his wife's maids, of course, since they had been given by Laban to his daughters precisely for that purpose, that they would be surrogate mothers for heirs, and that there would be then no need for Jacob ever to follow a roving eye to obtain elsewhere the fulfillment of children of his own. I found that quite interesting, that context that we were given there. Well, so there is much ado about the issue of Jacob the younger wanting to marry Rachel the younger. But there are the birthrights that belong to the elder. Now, the irony of Jacob's deceiving his father Isaac in order to steal the birthright and blessing from the elder brother Esau, Laban uses the same kinds of deception at night and the food and the feasting to trick Jacob. He thwarts Jacob's plan and his expectations, but ironically, he is preserving the birthright of the elder, of the sister. And ironically, we saw that Rebekah, in planning this scheme, is staying in line with God's promises that the elder would serve the younger. When we come to the children of Leah, then we've got Reuben, Levi, and Judah, who are the ones that carry on the line of the promised people coming to fruition. But anyway, in a sense, one gets caught in one's own web of deceit. After hearing Jacob's confession, we wonder, did Laban think his surrogate father role was to teach Jacob a lesson? So, if he confessed all of his ways that he was manipulating the situation in order to get or steal the birthright of his older son, was Laban trying to teach him a lesson for that? Or are we just supposed to read in this that, well, they're cut from the same cloth? Now, did Jacob go along with this situation and not cast Leah away because he knew his guilt and maybe felt this trick was going to be his penance? Might he have been thinking this is God's way of punishing him for his sin against his own father and his brother? It's kind of what goes around comes around kind of thing. Now, I've experienced in counseling with people that a lot of people accept their personal misfortunes and suffering sometimes as poetic justice, getting what they really deserve for some past sins, even though the present suffering isn't directly connected with it, a one-to-one relationship. It's just sort of the guilt that's lingering in one's heart and soul. When something bad happens, sometimes a person welcomes it as a way of doing penance for a sin that may have been a secret, never confessed, never made public, but yet it's been in their heart. And then when something bad comes, it's it's accepted and sometimes almost welcomed as doing penance. And, when a person is feeling like that, we don't hear the expression coming out of them, "Why me?" They accept it. They don't say, "Why me? I don't deserve this. This isn't fair." But anyway, I know there are a lot of great problems with professional groups trying to exercise self-discipline. For example, the issue of malpractice in medicine. It's been argued that if medical boards and the AMA did a much better job of supervising and disciplining their own, there would not be so many malpractice lawsuits. There would be a better practice of medicine if there was more self-discipline. But the problem is in judging and determining about any given incident, was it an honest mistake that could happen to anyone, or was it negligence, carelessness? It's hard to tell. And if anyone who is experienced in that line of work will understand better all the possible ways that an accident could happen. Someone who doesn't know the sophistication and the complexity of such a situation would be easier to think in black and white and be more judgmental. But the other part is could also happen is that if one is in a position of having made a similar mistake oneself, then one would be less likely to have the feeling, well, we've got to check everybody's records. We've got to shine this intense light on everybody in order to correct this problem. When if you call for that, then the light's going to shine on oneself and one's own mistakes might be shown. So there could be a real anxiety about being too hard and too aggressive in pursuing. So peer review has got its positive side in that people who really understand what it means to work in that field often can be better judges of a situation. But then again, if you're working in the field, then you could want to cut everybody a lot of slack so that you don't have to be scrutinized yourself and have things exposed about yourself that way. We also have the problem in the Roman Catholic Church with the self-discipline regarding the abuse of children. That self-discipline didn't happen. It didn't happen. And it shows the weakness of self-discipline. We have the issue of some people making mistakes that are technical, and then there are mistakes that are moral decisions. So those questions have to come to light. And unfortunately, there are a lot of really good people who will not ever run for political office because they've made some mistake in their life. They've overcome it. They may have made amends for it. They may have suffered for it. But to run for office, the opposition is going to go dig up dirt and publicize it. And a lot of good people don't want to ruin their career or expose their family to that kind of embarrassment and shame. And so sadly, that's another consequence. But anyway, Jacob may not have raised a huge fuss over the injustice done to him, because he realized what goes around comes around, and he's paying a price for his own deception. But the careful listener, one who will see the hand of God guiding this story, will see that in spite of all this family intrigue, that when they hear the names, when we get to reading the names of the children, how important Leah is in the story of God's plan for the children of Israel. Well, I got to the end of my notes, and I was going to... Oh, wait a minute. There were a few ideas in Sachs' commentary on this, in that he points out an aspect of this story might be the idea that God does not judge by appearances, the outward look. We see in some of the, like when God is choosing people, the criteria that God is using isn't the one that the culture uses. That God looks into the heart. Where people tend to look at outward appearances, God looks at the inward part. And he's saying that in this story that it's interesting that maybe the fact that Jacob immediately is attracted to Rachel because of her appearance, and that he does not love Leah because he is so focused on appearance, that he is shown that this is not the best way to make decisions. And so they lift that up. And then he says, goes to another point, love is an emotion, love is a virtue, and love is the ultimate bond between soul and soul, but without justice, love alone is insufficient to sustain the world, insufficient even to maintain peace within a family. A lot of times we have young people that are so in love and they think love will conquer all, but then they don't realize that there are so many other issues and matters that they will have to face, and if they don't deal with it carefully, the love gets eaten away because of the conflicts and the hurts and the resentments and so forth. But anyway, this is dealing with that in the sense that Jacob's love for Rachel and later Joseph is the cause of conflict between the two wives and their sons, and Jacob paid heavily for it. How heavily he did so makes clear many years later, speaking to Pharaoh in Egypt, where his long-lost son is now a man of power. The words are, "Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life." There is no other statement like that in Genesis, and it is all the more striking given the fact that Jacob has just been reunited with Joseph, whom he once thought would never see again. Love is not enough, for it leaves the less loved feeling unloved, and the result is conflict and sometimes tragedy. So he goes on to say that in that love is not enough, there must be justice, fairness, a regard for how your sentiments impact on others. in the end, it was Leah, the less loved, who gave Israel its holy tribe, Levi, and its kings, descendants of Judah. Weaving together these two strands of love, Jacob's intense feeling for Rachel, and justice. The deceiver is deceived. The story of Jacob, Rachel, and Leah turns out to be an essential prelude to the book of Exodus and the covenant between God and Israel, based on love and justice. For without justice, love is blind. Without love, justice is impersonal and cold. Jacob's family needed